I'm Bob Rubin, co-chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations and a member of the Advisory Council of the Hamilton Project. The Hamilton Project is an organization that was founded about 9 years ago with a really quite extraordinary advisory council that is focused on developing policies and then promulgating policies, bringing policies to the media and to primarily to Congress, but also to governors and senators, with respect to growth and broad-based inclusion, that is to say broad-based sharing the participation in growth and economic security. And one of the subjects that we have focused on is the criminal justice system, because the policies that we have today with respect to sentencing, parole, prisoner reentry have enormous economic effects. They're obviously important humanitarian issues, they're important social issues, but they're also very important economic issues. And so we have had two events, two policy conferences, if you will, in Washington, in which we focused on the criminal justice system as an economic issue. In the United States today, incarceration rates are 6 times the average of the large economies in the world that belong to an institution called the OECD. I don't think there's any question we have vast over-incarceration, and that has tremendous costs. It's obviously humanitarian costs. It affects not only the individuals involved, but their families and their children, social costs, but also has very large economic costs. Those people are taken out of the workplace. When they re-enter society, they very often have been disadvantaged with respect to their ability to re-enter and engage in the workplace. There's tremendous productivity lost. And I think we could have great gains for our economy if we had a different set of policies with respect to sentencing. And in that respect, I would say that there seems to be widespread agreement that sentencing is far too long for many crimes. Alternatives to sentencing, that is to say alternatives to prison that don't carry with them all the disadvantages of prison. If we had parole provisions that were more flexible, we currently have very highly inflexible parole provisions. If we had better rehabilitation within prison so the people who left prison were better equipped to enter the economic domain. And then finally, prisoner reentry. There are about 700,000 people a year that move from prison into society. And we do a terrible job of equipping these people to become part of the economic mainstream, and something we could do a great deal on, and I believe that the investment in doing it would have a very, very high return for our economy and our society. I also think there's some very specific policies that you can think of. For example, Pell Grants, which provide educational support for low-income people to go through college, used to go to people in prison so that people in prison could better prepare themselves for entering the economic mainstream. Unfortunately, the law prohibited the granting of Pell Grants to people in prison. That should clearly be changed. Secondly, felons very often lose their right to vote. That contributes to the stigmatization, to the stigma that comes from being in prison. That stigma is an impediment to getting employed. So there's a great deal that we can do. Unfortunately, many of the people who enter prison were highly disadvantaged to begin with in terms of their basic education, their psychological situation, drug use. All of that could be dealt with more effectively in terms of rehabilitation. And in terms of prisoner reentry, there is no doubt in my mind that if we invested a lot more in effective reentry, basic education, psychological counseling, training, job training, that the payoff would be enormous. And I think in terms of recidivism, crime is also a terrible problem. It has terrible social and economic effects. And I think the way we run our criminal justice system today increases recidivism beyond, probably substantially beyond, what it would be if we had a more sensible regime. A little over 50%, I think it's something like 53%, of people in prison have kids under 18. Just think of the effect that has on having a parent in prison has on those children. And so what it does is it contributes to replicating poverty, and I think replicating the potential, at least, for involvement in crime through generations. If we had a more sensible sentencing regime, we would greatly reduce sentences. If we had a much more sensible approach toward alternatives to prison, then we would enable many of these, I think probably a goodly number of people, to stay out of prison, which would keep them in the workforce and keep them in their families and keep them in their communities. So there really is a tremendous amount that could be accomplished for our economy, our society, and for communities if we were to put in a different regime in our criminal justice system than the one we have today.